This is the next video in the guerrilla cooking series. Now this one, we're actually pulling from the U.S. Army recipe book, which you can find online. If you look for it though, I'm going to tell you now, it is a huge file. Just be prepared for that. What we are going to be doing is the U.S. Army's version of chuck wagon stew. Now, most chuck wagon stew recipes you are going to find online are not chuck wagon stew. They're actually trail stew. Trail stew is a version of beef stew. Chuck wagon stew is, its main ingredient is baked beans, not beef. Basic ingredients for chuck wagon stew, and this is an old pioneer recipe: baked beans, some type of meat, either chopped up or ground meat, whatever you have available. It can be beef, it can be venison, it can be rabbit, squirrel, whatever you have available to you. Now, the U.S. Army version also calls for 2 veggies: green bell pepper and onion. It's later in the year, and this is all I got left for bell peppers right now that hasn't been chewed on by bugs. I'm not going to give you a specific measurements on the stuff you need. You basically add what you have available. For seasoning for this, you require some type of BBQ seasoning and your basic salt and pepper to taste. Now, to get this going here, I'm not going to be using this can because I'm going to be doing this for 2 people, me and combat cameraman. I'm going to be using a full-size can. So, first thing we are going to do is we are going to fry what needs to be fried. So if you have some fresh meat, you're going to want to fry it or grill it, whatever you have available at the time. If you got veggies, make sure to clean them, prep them, fry them so that they'll cook quicker. Now, before someone asks, where do you get the fresh veggies in the field? Well, in a survival situation, maybe you had a little survival garden hidden out in the woods. Your little apocalypse happened. You went to your bug out location and you're getting some of those heirloom veggies that you've been trying to grow wild from that garden, and you're going to use some of those. If you're in some type of resistance situation, you can do the guerrilla gardening, but also, more than likely, you helped someone out. You helped out a farmer or someone, and they repaid you by giving you some veggies. Because bell peppers are usually not pretty thick, you're just going to cut it into the size strips that you want. You don't have to worry about thickness of the strips. And this is the last pepper I have coming from my garden for this year. Now, if you're using a full-size onion, you're making it for yourself. Figure maybe half of it, save the other half for some other recipe. Otherwise, you can use green onions. Those will work just fine. Green onions are also referred to as winter onions. Just remember, your stuff cannot be over a 1/2 inch thick. If it is, it interferes with its cooking time. It will take a lot longer. And if you're in some type of resistance situation or survival situation, you're trying to cut down on your food prep time as much as possible so that you don't have a great big thermal signature out there to be found easily. Now this time I'm just going to add a little bit of oil instead of using bacon fat. Primarily to show the newer people you can use different types of fats. You can use oil. I do not recommend trying to fry anything without some type of fat to fry it with. There, that should spread the oil around pretty good. Now, while that's going to be frying, I'm going to be prepping right now the beans in my other pot here. And I'm sure someone's going to be a smart ass and ask, well, where'd you get the baked beans? Well, maybe you traded for them. Or maybe these are leftover beans from the night before. You made some Red Dawn baked beans. You still got some left. And you want to do something a little bit different. Here's a different recipe for you for those baked beans. Now, since the meat that I have is already cooked inside the pouch, I am going to add it to the beans right away. Just so I have that prepped off on the side. If I'm using a smaller fire, which is what you should be using in the field, that's going to be over your fire, your Dakota smoke hole right now, and while that's going, you're just prepping some other stuff on the side so that you can swap it out quick when the time arises. We're just frying the veggies to soften them a little bit to make it easier when we're cooking the stew. So basically you want to go until the onions start to clarify. If you want crunchier onions, you can add them in raw right into the beans. Just try cooking them there, or you can just fry them for a couple minutes and then chuck them in. Your personal choice. I do make chuck wagon stew usually after I make Red Dawn baked beans at home. I usually use some of the leftovers to do this. Other veggies that I typically add in there, if I have them available, I will add in sliced mushrooms if I can afford them. Another thing that I add in there is diced tomatoes, either from a can or fresh from the garden. If you're adding them fresh from the garden, wait till the stew is almost done before you add them, because if you add them too soon, they will break down. And all you're going to have is skins inside your stew. Now, chuck wagon stew, actually, for me personally, this is an old family recipe. This is something that my family's been making since the pioneer days, not long after we came to America. The original recipe that was passed down through the family has been lost over the years, so each little part of the family has their own way of doing this. But the most common ingredients you will see is baked beans and typically ground beef. cooking just a little bit longer for the onions, and then we should be good. This is an exceptionally easy recipe, an exceptionally simple recipe, and as I said, you don't really need measurements. Add in there what you have. If you have a little bit extra meat, fine. If you have it's primarily beans, fine. You don't have any veggies, fine. If you have extra veggies, fine. It's whatever you want, whatever you have available to you. And it is okay to just add the fat or oil into the stew. It'll just add to the flavors and that stuff. Kind of mix it up a little bit here. Now, recommendation I give, just add a little bit of water. Because you are going to lose some moisture in the cooking process. Normally when I do this at home I used ground beef or ground meat, but I had a package laying around of the shredded and I figured, well, just give it a try. It'll work just fine in this recipe. Now at this point we can add the barbecue seasoning. How much? That's up to you. I'm adding about a tablespoon since I'm making 2 batches here. 1 batch for me, 1 batch for Combat Cameraman. We did attempt to do this recipe literally a week ago, and we got to this point in the process of doing the video, and this is the spot where the camera shut off. And we can't exactly uncook what we had gotten to that point, so we swore, erased that version, continued on with the recipe, and then we had our meal of chuck wagon stew. And I know at that time Combat Cameraman said it was a really good mix. I was using the ground beef then. We're going to try it with the shredded, but I doubt it's going to affect the taste too badly. Basically what we're doing right now is we're just trying to get it up to a boil and simmer it for a little bit, not too long. Now, I'll address this right away. Does the U.S. Army make this in mess halls? Yes, or at least they did when I was in. It usually was like once every few months they made it. It was typically not a main dish item. It was a side dish item. Instead of having baked beans, they'd have chuck wagon stew that night. Just to change it up. Now, if you're going to use fresh meat and you're going to cube it up, try to make sure that one of the measurements on the meat is below that ½ inch so that it will cook through a little more thoroughly while you're trying to fry it before you toss it in the pot with the beans and everything else. Remember to cook the meat thoroughly. Now, any scraps that you have left over, any skins, cores, bones, any of that stuff, make sure to bury it, and make sure to bury it down deep enough that animals are not going to dig it out and potentially give away your position to someone who could be trying to find you, someone who's trying to pursue you, potentially kill you. I think we're pretty much at the point we can add our salt and pepper. So I'll add about a teaspoon for this. And I'll add maybe about 2 teaspoons of salt because that BBQ seasoning is pretty sweet. And the last time we did this, I and Combat Cameraman both ended up adding a bit more salt while we were eating it. It does not take long to do this. As long as the beans are already completed. If you're making the beans first in order to make this, remember, baked beans, making them from scratch, you're looking at between 8 to 10 hours cook time. So keep that in mind. Now I'm going to dish up Combat Cameraman's serving here. If you're doing this because as part of a two-man buddy team, obviously the person who's not on guard duty at the time can do the prep. And then just measure it out for when his buddy comes off a duty and can have his food. So there we go. And I am going to have some from mine. Combat Cameraman gives it a thumbs up, and so do I. So here you go. Another bean recipe for you so that you can have something other than baked beans and rice and beans or beans and rice. You know, to vary your diet in that survival situation. U.S. Army chuck wagon stew. Now, for all my engineer brothers and Patriot and militia movements, always remember, essay ons.